Hey, it's Alex. Welcome to Papertrail. My guest today is Paul M.M. Cooper. He's the author of River of Ink, his first novel, which came out at the start of the year. Really excited to get to his picks. He had some really interesting things to say about all of them and his own writing practice as well. Before we get to them though, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to everyone who listened to the first episode and gave some feedback. It's really nice to hear that people have enjoyed it and to hear your thoughts on how I can improve. So thank you, and please keep those coming. That's enough from me for now. Here I am speaking with Paul M.M. Cooper. Paul Cooper, welcome to Papertrail.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Congratulations on your book. I think it's great. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much.
And I'm really excited actually to hear about the 3 books that you've chosen for us. They're really interesting. I'll admit, not ones that I'm particularly strong on, so I think it'll be an educational time for me.
It's so exciting. I get to introduce you to 3 of my favourite books.
Yeah, definitely. That's half the fun of this podcast is I get to expand my ever-growing list of books I need to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Who doesn't need more books to read, right?
Great. So your first book, let's get straight to it, Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. I'm interested in the fact you chose Alias Grace because it is one of her historical novels, and perhaps she's more commonly known for sort of more fantastical science fiction novels. So why in particular Alias Grace? Why does that stand out to you?
Yeah, I think, recently especially, Margaret Atwood's got really into this kind of dystopian science fiction, like with the Mad Adam series and, the really famous Handmaid's Tale. But Alias Grace, I read this when I was about 19, maybe 18 even, when you're still in school. And it just really blew my mind about, the potential of historical fiction, like what can be achieved just by going back into the past and taking a factual event and dramatizing it, fictionalizing it for a modern audience.
I find that quite often when you're young, when you're sort of around that age, you get that first book where you're like, oh, you can do that.
Yeah.
You sort of realize, oh, yeah, that's how that works.
Yeah, something really gives you permission, that someone else did it and got away with it. I think that's a really big moment when you realize that. And I guess Alias Grace, it takes the story of a historical event, this spectacular trial in the 19th century of what they call a celebrated murderess called Grace Pamuk. So in the book she talks about how you can be like a celebrated novelist or a celebrated scientist and also a celebrated murderess.
So it's a great title.
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of just takes this character who no one really knows, was she guilty, was she innocent, did she actually murder, the master of the house where she was a servant and his housekeeper. There's all this kind of scandal about how she almost offered herself as a prize to the man who murdered these 2 people. So there's lots of kind of scurrilous talk about whether she was disguised paramour. I think Atwood uses this amazing window to talk about gender, power relations, class, and this amazing point in history where things are completely changing in Canada, where the American Civil War is just starting, and people are setting out westward into this cold wilderness, kind of revenant territory.
Something that I found quite interesting in that was something that I read in the AMA you did on Reddit. You sort of talked about when people were talking about your historical research, and you talked about the idea of you like to work with characters who aren't necessarily in the history books, or where history is not conclusive on them, and that feels like maybe that's something similar that you can see in, or at least with Alias Grace. I think Atwood said she changed her mind, or she had one opinion, and when she wrote Alias Grace, she had a different opinion as well.
Yeah, I think the funny thing about writing fiction about real historical events is you always eventually end up convincing yourself that your version is true. It's a really strange effect, kind of akin to when you just tell a lie enough times and eventually end up forgetting that it was a lie in the first place. Anyone who comes out of Alias Grace, still thinking that Grace Marks was guilty for this murder, and was probably not reading it carefully enough. But yeah, it's amazing, just kind of counterfactual about what if this person was entirely innocent. What if this entire trial was if she became a kind of scapegoat or flashpoint for the society's ills, it's an amazing thought experiment.
I think as well, sort of, you already sort of hinted to it there with when you're talking about sort of a lot of what Margaret Atwood does. She always finds ways to relate it to something. If it's in the past, then she somehow finds a way to relate it to the current age. And if it's sort of science fiction or fantastical work, she finds some way to sort of root it in the earth. And you know, a lot of Margaret Atwood's work is tied to the known world and history. And you're very big on your research. You know, again, like this Reddit AMA is great resource for me. But you're very big on research. You know, you should have PhD knowledge of any subject that you write about. Do you think maybe that's like Atwood and looking at Atwood and reading Atwood, do you think maybe that's where that came from for you?
I mean, yeah, possibly. I don't want to be too prescriptive about, you know, how much a writer really needs to do before they take on a subject, but it's more just like an inevitable consequence of, you know, living so long in a particular era or moment in history that you're just going to become completely immersed in it. You know, almost without realizing it, you'll be, you know, coming up with opinions about which particular you know, king in 13th century Sri Lanka, for instance, was the more progressive or whatever. I think, Atwood's research is incredible, and you know, each chapter is interspersed with these snippets from, you know, the trial logs at the time, and, you know, letters back and forth, and also author Susanna Moody, who visited Grace Marks in prison and gave some kind of account of her time there. So you really get the sense of being in like really safe hands with the historical research. And yeah, there's a really great point in the afterword where she says that she, you know, wherever possible, you know, made sure that whatever she wrote accorded with the historical record, but that wherever she found gaps, she felt free to invent, which I think is a really nice idea. And I think I take kind of similar liberties, that wherever I find a dark point in you know, history's knowledge, that's where you can really, you know, start blooming your fictive inventions.
Yeah, cut loose a bit and have some fun.
Precisely, yeah.
I think that's as someone who's not a particularly huge historical fiction reader, I think that is often when I do come across a piece of historical fiction such as your own that I really enjoy. I think it is that idea you're in safe hands. You know, like you are like, okay, this person, they know what they're talking about. They haven't just put like mentioned a clay pot in the corner to sort of show that it's, you know, you're in this age. Like there's a feel of control and self-assuredness that maybe that you get in a lot of really successful historical fiction.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the book I've written, you know, River of Ink, is set in the past, but I would almost like hesitate to call it historical fiction. I'm not even myself a huge historical fiction writer. You know, I much more read on the kind of literary side of things, and I think there are some amazing things you can do just setting your story in the past. I think like all three of these books like are kind of giving really interesting answers to the question of why we actually write about the past, why even bother setting something in a particular historical moment. Have you ever seen the film Goodbye Lenin? I always think about that film when I think about historical fiction. So it's just the story of a guy in East Berlin, you know, in the former Soviet bloc, you know, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And his mother is like an avid socialist, and she loves the Soviet Union. And she falls into a coma, and then the Berlin Wall falls down. And the doctor says, now, you know, don't give this woman any kind of shock, or she might actually have a heart attack and die. You know, if she's surprised by anything. He's like, well, the Berlin Wall's just fallen down. Her entire way of life has changed, and so he has to create this bubble around his mother, you know, pretending that the Soviet bloc is still continuing, and gets more and more elaborate. His like pretense that this is still going on, and it's just like this story that could only ever be told at this exact point in history when there's this, you know, amazing turning point, and suddenly like that human experience and that like discussion of, you know, the way, you know, we create the world around us, the way we interact with, you know, historical events, is the only time that story could be told.
I guess that's a good way of thinking about it, isn't it? Like, history does offer up these natural, you know, when, you know, you take a creative writing class, someone talks about you have to find your turning point, find the inception point, you know. I guess history does naturally lend itself, you know, you can go trawling through the history books and find more than you'll ever need in a lifetime. of different ones that you can play with. That's really interesting. I think it'd be nice to probably transition from that. Then, as you said, sort of all three of these books, they do sort of consider history. When did you come across My Name Is Red by Orhan Pamuk?
This was in my first year of university in Warwick, and I think we have a mutual acquaintance actually in Maureen Freely.
Yes,
who's also mentioned in your last podcast. So another shout out to Maureen Freely.
She's a running theme.
That's it. Yeah. We'll have to get her on at some point.
Absolutely.
So she was a translator of Pamuk. She didn't translate My Name Is Red, but she translated, I think, Snow in Istanbul. But yeah, so I guess having that acquaintance, I was introduced to Pamuk, and this book, I think, really more than any other, just really, I think, as you said earlier, just gave me that permission to do whatever I wanted. This is like a book that takes so much incredible liberty with, the way like a historical narrative can be presented. It has chapters narrated from the perspective of a dog and a gold coin. One chapter is narrated by the color red, and one by Satan. So you have this incredible like chorus of different voices, all of whom are being narrated by this kind of comedian storyteller in a coffee shop in Istanbul. And even though it's it's densely literary and it's beautifully created, it's kind of wrapped around the skeleton of a murder mystery plot, where there's this workshop of 4 manuscript illustrators, creating miniature gilded illustrations around these ornate books for being designed for the Sultan, and one of these artists has been killed by one of the others. So it sort of takes the form of an investigation into who committed this murder. There's this love story about a man who returns to Istanbul after many years away, and coming back to the woman he loves. It's a really incredibly beautiful book. Yeah, it's definitely the first book I recommend to people. And I'm always surprised by how many people haven't really, touched Orhan Pamuk, considering, he won the Nobel Prize in 2005, and he's been really feted internationally. But so many people I've spoken to haven't read anything by him.
I wonder how much of that there is sometimes, I find, certainly in my own reading, something that I'm trying to change, but there's sometimes a resistance to reading things in translation. And you're quite a big reader of sort of translated authors, aren't you? It's sort of something that you always seemed very interested in.
Absolutely, yeah. I think translation is a really interesting and like difficult question. Translation is almost like, it is the original book, but it's also its own thing. You have 2 artists really involved in the translation. The original artist and the person creating a new thing in this new language. There's a great online journal called Asymptote that deals purely in literature and translation from around the world. And the idea of the asymptote is that it's a mathematical term for 2 lines on a graph that get ever and ever closer but never quite touch. It's a beautiful image for the idea of translation, that you can get so close to the original but never quite actually attain it.
That's lovely actually. Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way, but that's really lovely.
Yeah, I think there are clumsy translations that kind of give the whole thing a bad name. But I think at its best, and I think My Name Is Red is absolutely an example of that. Not only is it completely inconspicuous as a translation, but it's a luminous work of art in its own right.
There's something that I noticed that kind of blew my mind when I read this. So the poem, which sort of River of Ink sort of flows around, that is a real poem, which you read a German translation, which you had to translate into German, or you read a German translation of, and then brought that across to English.
Yeah, one of my tutors at the time made fun of me and called me an overachiever for doing it. So this poem is the Shishupalavad, which so my character in River of Ink is a poet who finds himself suddenly having to work for a tyrant king, and he has to translate this poem for the king. And he finds himself, over time adding in additions of his own to the poem and becoming a kind of unlikely and reluctant revolutionary. So this poem, I was, determined to read it, obviously, because it was a huge part of my book. But there's no English translations of this poem, extant. There's one underway. I think a guy in Edinburgh was undertaking a translation, and I got in contact with him, and he said no, his funding had been pulled, and it had all been cancelled. I managed to find a 1926 German translation by a guy called Eugene Schultz. There's also a French translation by a guy called Hippolyte Fauche. But I think my reading German was a bit superior to my French at the time. So I kind of, went off on this long kind of, painstaking quest to stanza by stanza unpick this. It's about 80,000 words, I think.
Wow. Translated
into a kind of clumsy English. I think something that just really gave me so much respect for what a translator does. My translation is really not of the quality that I want to see published ever, but it was enough for me to understand it. And
I guess what's interesting, what I found interesting, is that you realize, translation it's a core part of the book as well. It is, as we just said, there's an art to translation, and in this book, someone is doing translation and applying his own art to that translation. So I just found it really interesting that you were doing some of your own translation as well at the same time.
Yeah, I always find that whatever you're writing about, your life will eventually end up copying that, whatever it is, in some way. It's a kind of weird effect of spending too long inhabiting a kind of fictional space. You eventually start just imitating it and mimicking it in your life.
Yeah. So some of the themes of My Name Is Red are huge. There's confusion, there's inner conflict, there's the idea of loss of identity as well. Are those sort of themes? And I suppose you can sort of see some of that in Alias Grace as well. Do you think those are themes that particularly leap out to you when you're reading books? Like, is that something that you find I love that? Like, I'm going to love this book because it's about X broadly.
I think something that absolutely always draws me in is ideas of memory, and Alias Grace is huge on this topic of memory, and it's kind of like an excavation of this woman's traumatic experience. So the doctor comes to visit Grace Marks in her jail cell, where she's been for 20 years, and he tries to take her back through this time when she was possibly involved in these murders, and where she has huge blank spots in her memory. And I think it kind of looks at how there are two approaches that we take when we try and dredge up the past in this way. And the doctor tries this kind of psychoanalytical approach of, gradually regressing her, using object association and so on. But another character in the novel tries this kind of like hypnosis, sort of slightly, pseudoscientific approach. That has connections with mediums and speaking to the dead. At one point, they have a séance style hypnotic session. I think it's actually a really interesting debate going on in historical fiction now about is the novelist who writes in history, are they someone using scientific methods and research to recreate this world, as I think Pamuk does, or are they like Hilary Mantel, who has said in interviews that she almost genuinely believes that she's communicating with the dead, that she's in some way channeling, for instance, Thomas Cromwell when she's writing, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, etc. I think one of my favorite things about My Name Is Red is this kind of backdrop to the clash of art styles in the East and West. So, these Turkish miniaturists who portray the world in two dimensions, but almost denying the effect of perspective in order to show, all of these characters in these huge courtly events and beautiful patterns. Whereas they talk constantly about how the Venetian painters are using these kind of tricks like shading and shadow to give the effect of three dimensions. And what this says about the kind of different philosophical approaches to art in the two different countries.
Yeah, well, that was something that when I was doing research on Orhan Pamuk, just in general, that clash seems to be at the heart of a lot of what he writes about. And it's interesting that you say that's something that really interests you. In that, again, that's another thing that I guess naturally would appear in River of Ink. There's this sort of clash of two cultures. You have someone who's is it literally sort of cross the ocean or across the large gap to sort of come in and imprint his own world and stories into a new place.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so my book story is set in the year 1215 in Sri Lanka, and it takes the historical character of a king called Kalingamag, who is remembered by history as being incredibly cruel and tyrannical. A Sri Lankan person I spoke to recently called him Sri Lanka's Caligula. Yeah, they're quite similar names actually. Now I think about it as well. Yeah, Kalingamag, Caligula. So there's this period of about 30 years where this king rules, and the Buddhist monks who for centuries have documented in painstaking detail the comings and goings of kings, who rules when, for how long, what buildings they built, what their achievements were. And for 30 years, these monks are subject to such repression that they're unable to write down their histories, or whatever they write is destroyed. And, once this king's eventually deposed, they write about, in incredible detail, all of his crimes and, how he, killed people, how he, tortured people, but also how he burnt books, which really stuck out to me as this incredibly modern phenomenon.
Yes, no, I remember that scene in your book where and there's sort of that you can feel the horror there of like, oh my god, all of this knowledge is being completely obliterated. I think that's quite interesting as well. You talk about sort of they weren't able to record, and obviously you can go back and you can record retroactively, but that we were talking earlier about the black space in history that you can fill in. So you did that sort of leap out as you was like, there's a natural gap, like there's somewhere I can go and fill in.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the kings in the book, the three king characters, and those are all historical figures. But I really just imagined that this, this demonic tyrant, that he wasn't so much a thug who, hated literature and wanted to just destroy everything, but he was actually a kind of more modern and interesting character in that he actually loved literature, but, was determined in a kind of propagandistic sense to make sure people were reading the right things.
He loved his literature.
His literature, exactly. So, I then just introduced the character of the poet. There's also the love story in the book. And these characters are the kind of smaller people who don't really make it into the great chronicles. But yeah, I've given myself, I think, that liberty to invent where history gives me the license.
So to leap from sort of the liberty to invent, this is where you're going to have to hold my hand a little bit, because the Sexing of the Cherry by Jeanette Winterson, this is a book that I know very little about. I've not really even heard its name. But from my research, it does sound very, very interesting. And it's sort of, we were talking just there about sort of liberty of imagination. That's something which the central character does a lot. He lives inside of his own head.
Yeah.
Quite a bit. But I wonder if you could just maybe introduce the book and break it down as best as you could break it down, and then talk about why it resonated for you so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult book to boil down into a simple explanation, but it essentially revolves around the character, two characters of this woman who keeps hounds in a kind of Elizabethan Britain, and she's this much larger than life character. She's kind of mountainously huge, an incredibly strong, kind of Herculean character, and her son Jordan, who kind of sets off across the world to make his fortune and find a better life. And it rotates around, this moment when, these fruits and vegetables are being brought back from the New World. Like, people are seeing a banana and a pineapple for the first time, and just being amazed by these events. But it's also a much stranger book than that. And periodically these incredibly fantastical things happen. You have a very normal scene, and then suddenly someone will just grab onto a passing balloon and fly off into the sky, to a different part of the city, and it's just woven in there like a very normal event when nobody really comments on it, and you start to realize that something a bit weirder is going on in this book. I don't exactly want to ruin the ending, but I suppose it really gets quite metafictional. You can start using the term historiographic metafiction. That's kind of a mouthful. About how this becomes a book about a modern character kind of inhabiting the life of this historical character. It starts to ask and provoke really interesting questions about, the place of the historical novel in the first place, and, what can be gained about the historical novel, what can be gained in writing about the past, and why, like a modern person, can invest so much of their time in imagining themselves into these different worlds.
And I think that's quite interesting for me, is that idea of linking things to the current moment or the current world, in terms of not just making it accessible to the reader, but sort of stuff always, when you start linking stuff forward and back from past, present and future, you start to see these sort of circles that you can play around with, and odd things start to happen. The bit there where you mentioned the person sort of grabbing the balloon and floating away, that feels very much like, I cannot remember the book, where they're traveling through this world on this high line, and then suddenly they spot like a giant like striding over the mountains in the distance, and then it's just, they never mention it again.
Yeah,
it's just, it just happens, and it's like a normal thing. Just a bit of a segue, but that just sort of that leapt out to me there as something that that you see in there. But it sounds like a fascinating, and the way that it plays with time again, and yeah, the way it plays with time sounds really interesting, because it's sort of historical and at the same time not, I suppose.
Yeah, it has these very beautiful passages about time, or almost as we imagine it, being a kind of illusion. Like the pastness of the past and presentness of the present being something we artificially impose on the world. And you do get this question later on in the book about whether these historical happenings are being imagined by a modern character. But it kind of provokes the opposite question in some ways. Is this modern character in some way the imagination of this historical character? There's like a real refusal to allow these two people to settle into their allotted places in history.
And they just sort of, they flicker and move around.
Yeah, kind of like the Tralfamadorians in Kurt Vonnegut. These alien creatures who can see all of time all at once, to whom the idea of like past and present really don't make sense.
Yeah. So Margaret Atwood and Orhan Pamuk, those are two authors who, just as a whole, you sort of, they're big inspirational authors for you. Is that true for Jeanette Winterson as well, or is it sort of more this book in particular has sort of leapt out at you?
Yeah, I was slightly cheating in choosing Jeanette Winterson, in that it's more a book I've read recently. But I think sort of the first two books are probably looking at like the books that have influenced me in the past, whereas Jeanette Winterson, has influenced me very recently and has kind of made me think differently about the work I'm writing now. Going into a second book. Yeah, I think what really I love about Pamuk and Atwood is they're both very literary authors, but they absolutely resist this stereotype of the literary novel as having a weaker story, or having a strong narrative drive is somehow being too commercial or selling out in some ways to the market. They're able to create these beautifully visual books, incredibly advanced works of art, but at the same time, absolutely drag you through them. They're both page-turner books that you just don't want to be over by the time they're over, and I find them incredibly compelling to read and really encouraging.
Yeah, no, I think that's often true for any book. Like, I think often when people get surprised by a book, maybe, is when there's something else there, like in My Name Is Red, you said there's a murder mystery at the center, or a sort of detective mystery at the center of it, and that's sort of, I absolutely agree. You know, there can be a level of snobbishness around literary fiction or something like that, where it's like, oh, you know, you don't want a narrative, you want beautiful words, or it's but certainly, yeah, the most successful ones, absolutely, you know, they have not always, but there's something there to drive you through, and that's always something really important to note. I think that why am I turning the page? Like, maybe you're turning the page because the prose is beautiful and you need more, but maybe there's something else at the core there that you want to explore, or you want to be explored, so that something can carry on forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely a fiction writer's first job to tell a good story. I think everything else, you know, really should follow that. It's kind of like that old design maxim that, you know, first of all, make something useful, and then once you've made it useful, don't hesitate to make it beautiful. And I think the use of a novel is really, you know, its narrative structure, its story, and what makes the reader turn the page. And I think, like a lot of literary authors, to some extent, have like forgotten that it's kind of their job to seduce the reader, to you know, entice them to come and read the book. You know, there's a lot of complaining about how, you know, people don't read as much anymore. You know, people, you know, watch too much TV and whatever. But I think that's maybe blaming the readers for a kind of general failure in a lot of like literary circles to actually, you know, tell a good story that makes us care about a character and want to find out what happens to that person.
I think I'd agree with that. Certainly, yeah. You briefly talked, just right at the end there, you talked about structure as well. I wanted to, this is something that I only spotted recently. I wanted to talk about your time briefly as a archivist for
Russell Hoban, yeah.
I wonder how interesting that was for you as someone who maybe, you know, you spend so much time with your own structure and with your own writing, how interesting it is to see someone else's own structure and break that down, and or maybe even an absence of structure, and actually go in and find the structure in it. I'm curious about that experience.
Yeah, this was in 2013 when I just moved down to London, and you know, I was doing some journalism 9 to 5, and I'd sort of been applying for jobs in sort of literary agencies, publishing places. And one of these places that didn't give me a job did kind of give me this strange part-time kind of work. And they said, "Oh yeah, you'll just be doing some archiving." I'd never really done any archiving in the past, but they seemed confident that, you know, it wouldn't be too difficult. And it resulted in me working to archive the letters and works and draft novels of Russell Hoban, who had died a year earlier and left behind filing cabinets and boxes and a whole room really full of strange and weird objects and letters from fans, you know, about 50 years worth of correspondence. You know, he was 96 when he died, and, you know, he'd been fighting in the Second World War when he was 18. It was an incredibly weird experience, kind of like being haunted by this man I'd never met. You know, sitting in his chair, reading his letters and his, you know, drafts of novels that he, you know, relentlessly and meticulously drafted.
There was you're saying about being haunted. There was a phrase that you used. You said, like, I don't think I've ever been in a room that missed its owner so much, or something along those lines. That sort of, and then you see, you know, there were some pictures that I saw. And I was like, bloody hell, like that must have been, yeah, quite daunting.
Yeah, Russell had a huge amount of obsessions. Some of them were like Punch and Judy shows. He loved. So the room was covered in, you know, these Punch and Judy puppets. You know, strange depictions of these puppets as well. And he loved the Assyrian lion hunts in the British Museum. He loved lions and King Kong, for instance. You know, the 1933 movie. And he just had these recurring obsessions and motifs that, you know, return over and over again in all of his novels, that were then just like, you know, sort of solidified in these objects around the room. It was incredibly strange. Yeah, Yeah, I mean, you come across some amazing things. I found an invitation to the White House from Barbara Bush from 1991, just flicking through his letters, and letters from Harold Pinter, and even one letter I picked up, and I was like, oh, hold on a minute, I recognize this handwriting. How is that possible? It turned out it was a letter from Quentin Blake, who.
Oh, really?
If you've ever read one of those old Roald Dahl novels, you kind of recognize that style of writing and drawing.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. That must be the surrealist thing to come across, when you're surrounded by history, to come across something familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you kind of, it's like any job. You sort of switch off your brain a little bit and just work through these hundreds of letters, just putting them in plastic poly pockets, filing them, documenting them, numbering them. And then just like a moment like that kind of shocks you out of it. And it was strange, being a young writer, just like setting out, and going through the things of, really delving into the life of this man who'd been a writer for 50 years and written a dozen novels. You're looking at like almost the advice he kind of passed back to you. It's a very strange experience, and I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah, no, it sounds like an amazing experience, actually. So, okay, so those are sort of your 3 books in brief, I suppose. You mentioned with Sexing of the Cherry, it's going to have some influence on what you're working on now in your next book. Or are you working on your next book right now, or are you just thinking about your next book?
I'm about halfway through the second book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What would you say is something from Sexing of the Cherry that you're like, this is... or is this something that you do, that you read something, that's great, I need to do something like that in this? Like, is there anything in particular that I'm having a balloon that picks someone up and takes them away? Like, is there anything in particular that leapt out at you?
I'll have a piece of that. I mean, it's not quite that black and white, I guess. You're almost just sometimes searching for a way to express a certain thing, or you feel like you're kind of grasping towards a way of thinking and structuring an idea that then you realize someone else is kind of also approaching, and you feel a bit of a kinship with them, and you sort of fold them a little bit into your canon, I suppose. I mean, I'm looking at a story that's going to have 2 interwoven storylines across a large gulf of time. So the idea of how the modern world and the ancient world interact is really interesting to me at the moment. So yeah, she's really kind of blown up my thinking a little bit on that.
I remember the first time I encountered someone who had, it wasn't Discworld, it was Edgeworld. It was an Edgeworld Chronicles book where they'd woven 3 storylines together. I think it was Quint. It was the first one from the Quint Quartet, or I can't remember. But I love this. But yeah, the first time I realized like this person has taken 2 things and woven it together, and it completely blew my mind that you could have these 3 different storylines and bring them together and make them into one.
But if you've ever been in Bath, there's a bookshop called Mr. B's Emporium of Reading Delights. It's a very beautiful bookshop, but it has its bathroom has been illustrated by Chris Riddell.
Oh, really?
Illustrations from Edgeworld. Yeah, those are great books, actually. I really enjoyed them.
Oh, I love them. Yeah, no, they're still one of my favorites, actually. But I haven't read them for years, but I go back. I'll Google image the Gloam Gloser or something, and just sort of remember all these feelings that I had as I was reading it.
I think the Curse of the Gloam Gloser is to this day one of the scariest books I've ever read. Oh,
it's terrifying, but so good, so good. Paul, I think we've come to the end, but thank you, and thank you for your recommendations. It's really been a pleasure to hear you talk about these books, and congratulations on your own book. I hope it does very well, and I'll be keeping a close eye for what's coming up next.
Yeah, thank you so much. And good luck with the podcast. It's such a good format. I'm really enjoying listening so far.
No, thank you. I'm having a lot of fun. Thanks for listening to Papertrail. I must apologise for the slight delay in getting this episode out. We had some technical difficulties. Thanks again to Paul for coming on. And if you're enjoying the podcast and have any suggestions about people you'd like to hear interviewed or how we can improve, you can get in touch on Twitter at PapertrailPod or on the website, which is just papertrailpodcast.com. Our music is by Scott Grattan.
and I'll be back next month. Until then, thanks for your time.